على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض إذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم. Can we please recite a Surah Fatiha for Marhuma Fatima Amir Ali Jan Muhammad and all Marhumins? Yeah. Okay, and all the martyrs of Pakistan today, inshallah.
Yes, I think it should be okay. So we'll see.
I'm just going to introduce you.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Today we are privileged to be joined by Dr. Stephen Jones, who will be talking to us about the dinner table prejudice, racial and religious forms of Islamophobia. Dr. Stephen Jones is a sociologist specialising in the study of Islam and Muslims in the UK and religious and non-religious public's perception of science. His research has focused on themes including Islam and liberalism, Islamophobia in contemporary Britain, Muslims' perceptions of science, and religious diversity and inclusion in STEM institutions and disciplines. He completed his doctorate in sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London, and subsequently held positions at York, St John's University, the University of Bristol, and Newman University, and before joining the University of Birmingham as lecturer in 2018. Can we please welcome him with a loud salawat?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And mild apologies for the this talk being somewhat different from the advertised title. I think there was a bit of Chinese whispers going on in between the Twitter direct messages between myself and McDard. So not to worry. I think this one, I should say, the advertised title does make sense, and I could talk about that, but I'm not quite so prepared to do so. So if you want to ask any questions about Islam and liberalism, I've written a book on it, so I'll be able to answer them. But I'll try and link them in if I can do that. So I think this one is somewhat more current, though. It's not the most uplifting subject, so I'm going to try and make it as uplifting as I can, but about the subject of Islamophobia. And I know it's one that's very dear to Miqdad's heart, and he and I have been in conversation about it in various different ways over the last few years. And part of what's at stake here, I mean, some of you might have been following the news a little bit around the situation with Nusrat Ghani, the Conservative MP who has been making claims of being removed from cabinet in part because of discomfort at her being a Muslim, and various other things that have gone on in political life. And there's been a lot of lobbying and activism around this area, and much of that has been directed towards trying to define what Islamophobia is and trying to work out how best to counter it. So what I'm going to talk about hopefully should be geared towards that. And some of you may be aware, or maybe not, it doesn't matter if you aren't, that's all fine, that part of that lobbying and activism has been aimed at trying to sort of respond to the idea that Islamophobia is somehow sort of too vague and too wishy-washy a concept to be applicable in public life and to be make use of. The accusation is often that Islamophobia is something that could potentially lead to a kind of backdoor blasphemy law or something similar to that. And so the attempts to define Islamophobia have, in a sense, been an attempt to push back against that. But the difficulty has always been, so it seems to me at least, that whichever way Islamophobia gets defined, there's always some kind of pushback in one way or the other. So recently, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims developed a pretty good definition of Islamophobia as a form of racism against Muslimness, sort of a kind of form of prejudice that's directed against the characteristic of being Muslim. But often when those kinds of definitions are put forward, what people on the centre-right do, and in the Conservative Party particularly, the English Conservative Party, I should say, not the Scottish Conservative Party, which takes a slightly different view, is to say that, well, Islam's not a race, so it can't be that. And then when one defines Islamophobia in terms of religion, there's a similar pushback saying something along the lines of religion does not deserve the same kind of protections as race or gender because I can choose to be a Muslim or not, whereas I can't choose to be a woman or not, or I can't choose to be of a particular ethnic background or not. So there seems to be a slightly circular quality to the public debate on this subject. And so with that in mind, what I did, well, it would have been about 2 years ago now, it was slightly at different kinds of racial and ethnic prejudice and prejudice towards religion more specifically. We don't have a very strong, so I'm a sociologist by background, some of you may know, some of you may not, but we don't have a very strong tradition of trying to survey people's views about tolerance and prejudice in this country. Not as strong as they do in the United States, for example, where there's many more resources to draw on. In this country, it's a lot harder to sort of pick up information about what people think on these kinds of subjects. There's some kind of information in the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is done every couple of years, but the questions there change. There are the occasional surveys by groups like Hope Not Hate, which is a sort of anti-racist charitable organisation, but not a great deal out there. So what I decided to try and do was get some money from the British Academy, to whom I'm very grateful for funding this work, and launch a small survey. I say small, it's small in sort of question terms. There were 1,600 people involved in it, and asking just members of the British public about their views about different racial and ethnic and religious minorities. And as I go through, I'm going to try and sort of tease out some of the main findings. And what I'm going to try and do is develop an argument about how Islamophobia is both racial and religious at the same time, and recognising both the racial and the religious aspects is important because they have to be recognised in slightly different ways. There are going to be bar charts. I apologise for that in advance. It's not the most interesting thing to be looking at. I'm going to try and make them as interesting as I can with pink circles and various other things like that, but apologies for that. So let's just go straight into the bar charts and I'll talk you through them. And as we go, I'm going to sort of take it step by step, talking about questions about ethnicity and then questions about religion, and then both together. And as I sort of go through it, hopefully a sort of picture will have emerged of what I'm trying to argue. So here we go. I'll try and keep it as simple as I can. There's a few technical statistical things in there as well, but nothing that will require a huge amount of knowledge. So the first thing that we did, so this is myself and, hang on, sorry, let's get this to work, okay. Having a bit of struggle moving the slides. Oh, there we are, we've got it. Okay, so the first thing we did, this is myself and my colleague Amy Unsworth, who's based at University College London. So we asked questions about different ethnic and religious minorities in Britain, and asked people a range of different questions. And we tried to do this about various different groups. And this was the whole range of different groups. It's probably too small for you to be able to see from the slide, so I'll work through it. the first thing we did, look at these people, they're coming up and looking right close. It's good. It's all right. So we asked questions. This is a fairly standard thing that sociologists do. We ask questions called warmth questions, where we ask people to rate how positive or negative they feel towards different groups in society. And on that bar chart that you can see there, if you see the red bits represent people who indicated that they felt negative towards a particular ethnic or racial group. And so I'm sort of asking these questions as groups of people. So groups of people meaning Gypsy or Irish travellers, that's the people at the top, Pakistanis, Black African, Black Caribbean people, white British people, Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, and Christians. So different ethnic and religious groups. And these were asked in 2 different questions, but merged together. And you can see, if you can read the writing there, actually, I tell you what, I've got some pink circles which will help out here. You can see from the pink circles there's 2 sort of red bars that stick out quite dramatically in that. And that's, the top one there is for Gypsy or Irish travellers, and the one on the 25.9% circle, the second circle down, that's Muslims in the UK. So you can see there that those are the 2 groups that really stand out. When you ask the British public, they're the 2 groups they suggest they feel most negative about. Now, one important point I should say at this point in the presentation is that this doesn't necessarily mean that these are the 2 groups that suffer the most discrimination in British society. One of the slightly comic things, it's not quite, sort of darkly comic things about these kinds of surveys is how people answer in certain questions. So you can see if you look to the middle, if you look around, there's the column there, third one down, representing Black African and Black Caribbean people, and they have 6.4% of people acknowledge feeling negative towards that group. And then white British people, the one below that, is 8.4%. So when you ask the British public, do they feel negative, they suggest they feel more negative about white people than they do about black people, which is a very strange thing, because you can look at sort of stop and search statistics, you can look at university entrance statistics, university progression statistics, and you can show that there is severe discrimination against black people in this country. It's actually more severe in certain contexts than for any other group. So there's no necessary link between discrimination against a group and people acknowledging that they feel negative towards a group. So the way I see these 2 spikes, these red spikes you can see on this chart, is not so much levels of discrimination, it's the extent to which people feel they can get away with saying things about a group. The way I phrase it when I'm writing academically is to say there's little social sanction, so little pushback against feeling negative about this group. There's a level of acceptability when it comes to prejudice towards Muslims and towards Gypsy and Irish travellers that is not there for other groups, such as Jews. There is anti-Semitism in this country, we know that, but it's not quite so acceptable to say this out loud. I think that's the best way of reading these kind of statistics. So that's the first thing that we can say from this survey. Next thing we did is ask a bit about questions about tolerance. So are people willing to support discriminatory treatment of certain groups? And in that case, and this one doesn't ask about Gypsy and Irish travellers, it does ask about Muslims. That's the, hang on, do I have a circle? I don't have a circle there, I should have put one in. The column with the little spike you can see, that's Muslims there. So 18.1% willing to support some kind of prohibition on migration to the UK from Muslims. But that, I should say, it comes with a certain caveat that a lot of the people answering this question seem to just answer across the board the same answer. So it may be just that people are opposed to migration per se. The third thing we did is ask questions about anti-Semitic and Islamophobic conspiracy, much smaller, but still a concerningly high level. So far so depressing. We'll get further into the, hopefully, I'm going to sort of talk through some depressing statistics and hopefully end on a slightly more positive note of how to get rid of the problem, I think. So let's say a bit about where this kind of prejudice is distributed. So the question I want to ask now is, which different groups in British society do we find the prejudice to be most commonly located? Where is it concentrated? And that is something that you find is, for the most part, not entirely, but in most cases, fairly consistent. And part of what my argument consists of here is pointing out cases where these rules that I'm going to set out are not followed. So the distribution of prejudice in this country. So this is another complicated bar graph with very small writing that you may not or may not be able to see, but I'm going to help you out with some extra little purple squiggles. And these bars contrast different groups in society. So the one at the top there, you can see the simple way of describing this is to say that prejudice tends to be concentrated in certain sectors of British society. It tends to be people who are older, people who are men, people who tend to vote Leave in the EU referendum, and people who vote Conservative in general elections. And you can see this if you look at the little squiggles. The two at the top there are over 65s as opposed to 18 to 24s. And this is the question about Sharia no-go zones that I mentioned a second ago, where you can see that 39.8% of over 65-year-olds agree with that statement, compared to just 13% of people who are 18 to 24. So there's huge differences between different parts of the British population. There's a big spike in men as opposed to women, so 30% compared to 22%, and an even bigger spike. So the real difference is the very bottom two that you can see just there. If I sort of point, the camera's got me there. Conservative voters, 43.4% agree with this kind of conspiracy, compared to with Labour voters and Liberal Democrat voters, I should say, who aren't on this chart. It's around 14%, 14.7% in the case of Labour. So there are big differences between different groups of society when you ask not just this question, but this goes for pretty much every question, with a couple of exceptions that we asked in this survey. So if the same kind of patterns apply if you ask people about different anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, questions about migration bans, whatever the question is, generally speaking, the patterns are pretty similar. So, one other thing I should say. There's an interesting question about when it comes to prejudice in British society, and Islamophobia more specifically, whether this is something that's religiously motivated or comes out of sort of the UK's secular identity. Sociologists like myself are constantly arguing about this kind of thing. Is Islamophobia because Europe is secular or because it's foundationally Christian and so on? The survey has some interesting stats on that. You can see, or you might be able to see, if you look around the middle, there's another spike that I ignored there, where people who affiliate with the Church of England seem to be more likely to suggest there are Sharia-controlled no-go zones than non-religious people. But that's actually quite misleading. If you look a bit further into the data, so we have 3 charts there, and what I've done is sort of divided the survey population up along 3 different ways. So when we measure religion, if you're a sociologist, you measure it in 3 different ways generally, with belief, with belonging, and with behaviour. So belief, do you believe in God, or something like that? Belonging, do you identify as Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever else, or non-religious? And behaviour, i.e. do you attend a mosque or a church or some similar kind of religious meeting? And the interesting thing is, and this is not just this survey that's come out of it, but when you ask people about how they identify, in this survey and in other surveys, the people who identify as Church in England or Anglican tend to seem to be more prejudiced towards minorities than others. But when you look at other measures, so people who attend church or people who believe in God, they appear less prejudiced than people who do not believe in God or do not attend church. So what we seem to find, and this is a variety of surveys that have seemed to indicate it, there's a kind of ethnic Christianity effect going on somewhere. However, in this survey, that didn't appear. Basically, I have to cross out this one. There's a big purple cross, because what you find also is that people who identify as Church of England in this country, they tend to be a lot older. So really, it's an effect of being older rather than being a member of the Church of England. So there we are. That's kind of going through those kind of ethnicity. And so they're the various measures I would use to try and categorize racial and ethnic prejudice. And when we describe racism against Muslims, this is the kind of thing that I and various other people who write about Islamophobia have in mind. This kind of notion of Muslims being targeted because of their belonging to a particular group or because they are seen as belonging to a particular group. That's the way we try and define it. So with that in mind, what I tried to do then is single out, more specifically, anti-religious prejudices. And the way we did that was by asking, well, a bunch of different questions, really. We asked questions just generally, do people like religion in this country? And I'll circle one particular answer here. We asked lots of different questions, and you won't be able to read them all, but I'll read one out here, which is we asked, Do you agree with this statement? Looking around the world, religions bring more conflict than peace. And what you get from that answer is that British people really do not like religion in any kind of way, shape, or form. They don't like it at all. So 71.4% of people agree with that statement, and 8.3% disagree with it. And that is, the interesting thing there is, even if you're a Catholic or a Church of England person, if you tick that particular box, there's still the majority opinion amongst Church of England members and Catholics. Not so much, we don't have enough people in the survey to talk about minority religions, but it didn't come out in those cases. So that's one thing, they don't like religion at all. But not liking religion is not necessarily the same as being prejudiced, I don't think. So we asked a few more questions about that. We asked people to say, do you think any particular religion has an especially negative impact? And this is something called an open response question, where we ask people to type in their answer. So not everyone has answered, but it doesn't come out well for Islam. It's not, so we have about 31% of the survey population answered, and of that's 31%, 64% said Islam are Muslims, which is really worrying, honestly. That's about 20% of the survey sample, and given that this was open response and people could just skip past it, it's a bit concerning. Nevertheless, we asked one further question. This is the one I try and single out because it's the most useful. It's a little bit technical, so bear with me. But it's a way of trying to test whether people have misperceptions of particular religious traditions. We asked a question. I'm going to have a quick drink because it's a bit of a sentence to read. So here we go. We asked the question, for each of the following religions, please say whether you think the religion teaches its followers that its sacred text should be taken literally, word for word, or symbolically, understanding its poetic meaning and historical context. Now, that's quite a complicated question. I don't know the exact answer at all. And in a way, it's designed as a kind of trick question, because there are a range of different answers that you might give, and they might all be correct in some shape or form. There is, though, I think it's fair to say, definitely a wrong answer, which is to say, if you think that Islam or Sikhism or Christianity and Judaism are taught entirely literally, that there is no tradition of symbolic interpretation in any of these religions, or that there's no kind of accounting for historical context, then I take that to be a kind of measure of prejudice, a sort of soft prejudice, you might say. Not the same as abusing people on the street, but a kind of misperception that people hold. Because it's not true for any of those religions, I would argue. And you can show that that's also not the case. In fact, I might have the slide here. And let's just have a quick look. Yes, I do. This is from a different survey. You can show that this isn't even what British Muslims think if you survey them. We just had a different survey done by my colleague Fern Elston-Baker, where I don't have the circle here, but there's a question where it says, the sacred writing's spiritual truth is more important than its factual accuracy. And if you ask British Muslims that, there's far more, the sort of red boxes you can see there, far more say yes than no. So you can sort of disprove that even at the level of social science. So, we asked that question anyway, about whether you think religions are taught totally literalistically or not. And this red the red column is it on your right as well as my right, that's good, is the one that we use as an indicator of prejudice, okay? So we can see again, we have a lot of misperception around Islam. 21.1% of people indicating they think Islam is taught totally literally. And I think the interesting thing there is that this is a prejudice specifically about Islam as a religious tradition, as a set of teachings, rather than as a sort of group membership. We're not targeting people because they look a certain way or because they're being racially profiled in an airport, although we know that happens, but it's because of a misperception about Islam as a religious tradition. And the interesting thing here, if you look a little bit closely at the data here, so if you ask about Sikhism, for example, if you ask the British public about Sikhism and ask this question, most people, 62.7%, say, I haven't got a clue. Because why would you? I mean, I don't know much about Sikhism. I work in a department of theology and religion where we have Sikh studies as a master's. I still don't know very much about it. And that's probably how I'd answer. I don't really know. In the case of Islam, people in Britain feel a lot more confident making a judgment. So that the number of not sure falls down to about 40%. But people feel more confident making a judgment, even though they end up making incorrect judgments. So what that says to me is that in British society, people are being kind of systematically miseducated about what Islam is really about. There's a real kind of tendency to mislead people and miseducate people in different ways. And so when we talk about Islamophobia being a kind of racism, I think that is definitely true. I'm not going to argue against that. But I think there's also a tendency and importance to recognise that it's about systematic misperceptions that British people hold. And often not necessarily coming out of a sense of animus or hostility, but just simple confusions, and that hopefully we should be able to correct. Okay, so I'll skip past that. All right, I'm going to skip past that bit as well, because that gets technical and into statistics, and I can talk about that later if I need to. So here's the bit that, so I don't know if anyone saw this at the time. So I launched this as a report in the end of January, and it got a bit of news coverage in The Guardian and ITV and a few other places, and Sky did a short report on it, which was very pleasing. But this is the bit that the newspapers all picked up on, and I think for good reason. Where we start to compare, so I started off by talking about anti-ethnic prejudice, kind of forms of racism in British society, and then talked about religious prejudice. And the interesting thing I find is when you compare these two things together and how they work out. So there's going to be more bar charts, but I'll try and talk you through it all, and hopefully you won't get too bored by the bar charts. So I said before that what you find when you look at where prejudice is located in British society, it's fairly consistent. And I've got another little graph that tries to illustrate that. You see it, so this is the red bars you see where people are feeling negative towards people with Pakistani background. Of course, are mostly Muslims, so it's interesting the way that the different sort of ethnic and religious markers are responded to differently in surveys. So again, we find amongst this group, views of this group, people who tend to be more negative are overwhelmingly older, conservative voters, men, and Leave voters from the EU referendum. But there's also another interesting one, which I'm going to circle here, where you can see that the higher negative, it's only marginal in this particular one, but there's a slight 15.7% compared to 13% that falls along class lines. So in surveys and in market research, people refer to groups as C2DEs and ABC1s, for which I apologise. That's a sort of shorthand for basically people from working class backgrounds and people from upper and middle class backgrounds. So it's a test of what kind of job you do. So if you're in a manual occupation, you're classed as a C2DE. If you're in a sort of upper professional occupation, ABC1. That's the way they do it in market research and the way they do it in this particular survey. So, and what we tend to find in most of these questions is a slight tendency towards working class people coming across as being slightly more prejudiced towards different groups. That's not always, pardon the statistical jargon, it's not always statistically significant, but it is in some cases. We see a significant difference between working class people and middle class people along these lines, with the working class people appearing as marginally more prejudiced. And that seems to kind of follow the line of our political debate. I know since the Brexit vote in 2016, there's been a slight, if you follow the politics news, a sort of slight fixation on this idea of a red wall voter who lives in places like Mansfield or Northwich or sort of small towns in the north of England where they're working class, sort of salt of the earth types, but socially conservative. And there's been a sort of pandering to that kind of imagined voter who is supposedly anti-immigration and so on and so forth. And there is a certain basis to that. But what I think this survey quite usefully does is pull that apart in certain ways. Because when we ask about ethnic measures and different forms of racism, it is the working class people who seem to emerge as being more prejudiced. However, this is the interesting thing I find, is when we ask the question about religious prejudice, this question about do you see Islam as being inherently literalistic, it's actually the middle and upper class people who appear as more prejudiced. And so you can see the little purple circle. It's the ABC ones who, the spike is only small, it's only 5% or so difference, but that's still, in sociological jargon again, a statistically significant difference. So even if we account for age, for gender, for the way people vote politically, that still has an effect. And I think there are two things potentially, I'm speculating slightly here, but I think there are two things going on with this. I think the first thing is, and I say I'm speculating slightly, I have done interview research around this as well, so it's a slightly sort of informed speculation, it's not kind of just guesswork. But I think there's something going on here where, with people from a more liberal background, more middle class background, there's a tendency, and I found this in interviews with people as well when I've been doing qualitative work, to style oneself as being anti-discrimination, being in favour of equal treatment of people. but nevertheless hold on to or have beliefs about Islam that are very heavily stereotyped. I remember doing an interview with someone, this was prior to doing the survey, and this actually kind of led up to this survey in some ways, which has always stuck in my mind, where I was talking with someone who's very liberal politically, and was talking throughout this interview about the problem of anti-Muslim discrimination, but then at the same time making comments about what Muslims are required to believe about this or that or the other, and thinking, as someone who sort of teaches Islamic studies, that's not what Muslims are required to believe at all. I'm not sure where you're getting that information from. And it's a kind of misperception that's amongst the sort of liberal middle classes, I think, and a tendency to feel that when it comes to religion, we don't have to have the same sorts of sensitivities. I think there's also something going on here as well about education and the way we're educated in British society, because the interesting thing you can see there, if you look really closely at the bar charts, is that the people from the working class backgrounds, when it comes to religion, they're more likely to say they don't know. They're like, I don't really know. But the people from upper and middle class backgrounds are more likely to have an opinion, and they're more confident in making their opinion known in the survey. And I think what's happening here a little bit is that they're more educated, but because we tend to be miseducated about Islam in the UK, they're more miseducated as well, so more likely to make an incorrect judgment. So there's something interesting going on there about the way in which we talk about religion in society and the way we misunderstand Islam in particular. So I'm going to come back, I'm running out of time and I don't want to take too long. So I'm going to come back to where I started, which is to say these sort of political debates we have about trying to get some kind of recognition for Islamophobia in British society and trying to push back against it. Because though it is a serious problem, there are a lot of good organisations and indeed good MPs across the whole range of the political spectrum, not just on the political left or liberals, but in the Conservative Party too. Some who would surprise you, like Steve Baker, who is about as far to the libertarian right as it's possible to be, very strongly Brexit, against zero carbon emissions and all these kinds of things. But actually on Islamophobia, he's quite solid and a member of the APPG on British Muslims. And so there's a lot of ground, I think, to be trying to win recognition for Islamophobia and understanding what it is. And I think the thing I want to try and argue with this survey is really, it has to be, in a sense, two-pronged. On the one hand, recognising it as akin to a form of racism, when we sort of racially profile people at airports because they're suspected terrorists and so on. But also there's something about the way we talk about religion in British society and how we need to think a bit more about religious literacy as not just kind of songs of praise on a Sunday afternoon, but actually being about trying to educate people in the necessity of religious literacy just as a matter of equal treatment and being able to understand that people deserve equal treatment. That's a part of that component, which we don't really do very well, if I'm entirely honest. So that's where I'm at with this, and I hope that's been illuminating in some way. Happy to talk about any other parts of that, some of the other statistics we had, or anything in between. Yeah, so I'm all ears, essentially. So I hope you've managed to get something out of it.
Thank you so much. We have a bit of time for question and answers, so please let me know if you have any questions. Start.
Thank you very much. Very interesting findings, actually. Although, as you say, surveys are surveys, so we can't really... but they are pointers towards what is happening. What I was wondering is that if we want to, for example, take race altogether out of the Islamophobia debate, has anybody done, are you aware of anybody doing a survey like this on white English Muslims?
Yeah, I don't know any surveys. The thing is with surveys like this is that it's quite easy to do something about the main sort of white British population. It gets very, very expensive as soon as you start trying to target a minority group. So if you want to do a survey of Muslims specifically, it's going to cost you loads of money. So that's really why no one's done anything on white British Muslims. But there have been sort of qualitative studies. Someone I know, and I think he's based in Singapore now, but did his PhD in this country called Leon Masavi, who did his PhD on white British Muslims and their experience of... And then he describes it as a kind of process of losing your whiteness and being a sort of white traitor, as it were. And that's one of the ways in which I think Islam is kind of racialized, because it's associated with images of different kinds of white status, almost, not just as a sort of skin color, but something that is associated with skin color.
Because as you will be aware, of course, that for anti-Semitism, it's Jews as a race. Judaism is not a subject of discussion in that way. It's just Jews, and that's why it's easy to legislate because it's against a particular race. Here, you have, of course, more than one race, more than one color, all kinds of things.
Well, I think you're right and wrong at the same time. I mean, you're right about Jews and race in some sense, because Jews have been protected, and Sikhs as well, since about, I think, the 70s, maybe the 80s, as a racial group. So they're recognised in law. This is before we had religious discrimination laws in this country. But, I mean, Jews are highly racially diverse at the same time, and even though they're constructed as a race, there's no kind of reality to that. You know, I have Mexican Jewish friends, there are black Jewish people, there are white Jewish people, there are all kinds of different shapes and sizes and colours of Jewish people as there are for anyone else. I think the point is that race is something, and this is part of the confusion about this idea of Islamophobia being a form of racism, is race is something that is as much constructed as it is determined. But, you know, I can't escape the fact that I look white, and that's biologically determined, and no one disputes that. But you can still socially construct certain groups, irrespective of their skin colour, as racially determined. Like Irish people, for example. If you look at sort of racist writing about Irish, you know, they look as the same as me, as far as I can tell. But if you look around the turn of the century, there were people saying they come from different lines of descent and more Iberian than Anglo-Teutonic. And it's the same with Jewish people, too, who were sort of constructed in a certain way.
So the last question is this. That how much of this, if you like, ingrained attitude against Muslims a result of the historic encounter between Muslims and the UK or whatever?
Oh, very good question. That, I think that's the sort of question, if I had the answer definitively, I'd probably be paid more than I currently am. Because it's actually a question I set for my students this year, and most of them were very confused by it. So, to what extent is Islamophobia a historical phenomenon or something that's contemporary? I mean, the word itself is fairly recent. I mean, it's not been in use for more than 20, 30 years, in any kind of popular form at least. But there are parallels between, you know, the idea of Muslims as terrorists, for example, has kind of historical antecedents with this idea of Islam being a warlike religion, and the veiling and the way that results in prejudice, that has long historical roots into colonial history as well. So I think it's one of these, so I have a couple of friends and colleagues, so Ben Gidley and Keith Conharris, who are people who write about anti-Semitism, and one of the things they said in relation, they wrote an article in The Guardian in relation to this debate that was going on in the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn, and they were saying that the best way to think of anti-Semitism is not just a facet of the left or the right, or it's not just something that comes and goes. It's like a reservoir of resources, cultural resources we can draw upon at certain times. And it's historical resources we can pick up or we can put down, but they stay with us. And I think Islamophobia is a little bit like that. It's like it spikes, it has spiked in the last 20 years post 9/11. A lot of the kind of Islamophobic tropes we have now, people wouldn't have recognized in 1995 or whatever else. But those are sort of picked up from history. They're not just invented from nowhere. And I think that's the best way to think about it myself. Far away.
You said English people didn't care much about religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then why are there lots of religions in this country, as well as English people?
That's a very good question. And it's a good job I'm a sociologist of religion, and I'll be able to give you your answer. It's because English people are weird. So here's the strange thing about English people. So in 2001, in the census, 73% of people in this country said they were Christian, but only 10% of those people go to church. So there are about it's less now, it's about 5 times as many people say they're Christian as go to church. And so I think it's that people feel Christian in some kind of way, but without necessarily attending church because they're too lazy and they don't like giving up chocolate for Lent and other things like that. So, and then also the other thing that's, when you say there are many religions, that's because of changes in society. So there are fewer Christians, there are more non-religious people, but there are more different religious groups too. So Muslims used to be about 3% at the turn of the millennium 20 years ago. Now it's about 5 or 6%. So big changes going on in British society at the moment. So that's why.
Sorry, I just forgotten. How many people were in the questionnaire?
1,667 is the exact number. So that's a lot of people that you're going to have to ring up and ask questions. I didn't do that.
And in the questionnaire, for the people, like, were they mostly Muslims or like Christians or Jews or?
So there were mostly non-religious people and Christians. The reason for that is, for a whole range of complicated reasons that I can't fully explain even if I tried, minority religions are not very well represented. So this survey was by a company called YouGov, and they do a lot of the political polling, like who's going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer, who's going to vote for Boris Johnson, that sort of thing. What they try and do is they do something called weighting, where if you know how many people are from the north or the south or from who are rich or poor, you can modify your survey so it maps onto the population of the country. But they don't do that for minority religions. They don't do it for Jewish people or Muslims or so on. What that means is there's far too few in surveys like this. So that's one thing to bear in mind. There's about 17, I think, in this survey who are Muslim, which is a teeny tiny number and no way corresponds to the actual number of Muslims in this country.
When you said English people were weird, first question, what do you mean? Second question, what inspired you to do Islamophobia? And in your case, what do you think Islamophobia is, and how would you sum up this lecture, and what is Islamophobia again?
Give me some easy questions, why don't you? All right, English people are weird in all kinds of ways. I mean, yeah, I could spend all day on that. But I think the particular weirdness is that they all say they're Christian but don't go to church, which is a bit like, saying you're Muslim but then never going to mosque and drinking a lot and eating the pork. What inspired me to get into Islamophobia? I think, so I was about 20 in 2001 when people attacked the Twin Towers. And I remember I was at university, and I remember being thoroughly confused at what the papers were getting away with saying about Muslims at the time. And I think part of that, so I'm from a church family. My dad ordained as a minister about 20 years ago now in the Church of England. So I've had a religious upbringing. I have a very religious family in some ways, going the full range of Catholic through to Plymouth Brethren, which is like a very radical Protestant sect. And I have a slightly better background in religion sort of through my family than most people, I think. And I couldn't quite fathom how bad people were in this society at understanding religion and understanding religious communities. And I think that's always bothered me, I think. I hope that's a good answer.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you for the excellent talk. I'd just like to... whenever someone seems to give a talk on Islamophobia or on racism, nobody actually bothers to define the term racism. And I find when people are using the term race, it's very different in the minds of the people having the argument. So you'll see lots of debates on the TV, for example, and people will be talking about racism. And the two people will be talking about a completely different concept of race, and nobody will actually sit and say what racism is. What do we even mean by a race, right? So before we can actually talk about Islamophobia, would you be able to tell us what race is, and then in that context, then tell us what Islamophobia is?
Yeah, sure. So, what race is? So you're right. Generally, people will be talking completely at cross purposes in this, and generally that's because people on the conservative right in particular think of race or argue about race as though it's skin colour. So you or I might be different races simply because of that. The problem with that is that, as I was saying a bit earlier, people have been constructed racially even though they are white. So I don't think there's any real argument that anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Nazi ideology was one of the most powerful racist ideologies that the world's seen, and it was all built around this idea of Jews as being a subhuman race. So it's too simple to think of race as being just about skin color. So what is it then in that case? Well, you have to think about it as being, I'm going to try and be as articulate as I can here because it gets more complicated, a kind of an internal hierarchy within the human species of different subgroups. So some kind of way of subdividing the human species into different groups that give some greater status than others. And that's normally not just internal divisions in terms of class, for example, how much money you earn. It's about the kind of person you are. And that's normally to do with things like bodily appearance or some kind of projected characteristics that people are supposed to have. But it's not always just that as well. It's sometimes kind of cultural forms as well. I mean, if you look at I have a friend and colleague, Tariq Modood, who's written a lot about what he calls cultural racism, which I don't always agree with the way he writes about it, but I think he has some very strong points, which is to say, if you look at anti-Asian racism, particularly in the 90s, in the sort of pre-9/11 period, that very rarely made claims about biology. It was about skin color, but it wasn't sort of to do with Asians being necessarily less intelligent than other people. It was to do with them being culturally backward, supposedly. But it still motivated profoundly racist behavior. So I think it's to do with trying to divide up the human species into different subgroups. That's the way I think, a sort of hierarchy of humanness.
Do you think this, both the rise of Black Lives Matter and its pushback now, has some lessons for how to deal with Islamophobia?
Yeah, good question. Yes and no. I mean, I think there are, yes, in the sense that mass mobilizations, like we've seen with Black Lives Matter, can have a really powerful effect in changing people's opinions. But at the same time, I think the difficulty with comparing between Black Lives Matter and the case of Islamophobia is that they're starting from slightly different points. Because, like the survey seemed to show, no one wants to admit that they dislike black people. That's not something that people will normally even admit to themselves, I don't think. You know, no politician is ever going to say that. They'd rightly lose their job if they did. So, though there is discrimination, there are kind of powerful cultural resources that we can use against that in some kind of way. Like the English football team being able to sort of take a stand and stand up even to people on the conservative right and successfully argue against them. In the case of Islamophobia, there's more work to be done, I think. There's not the same kind of basis, and I think part of the reason that it's a complicated story behind why that is the case, I think it's partly because we've not had the same long-term history of trying to act against it. You know, anti-racist activism goes back to the 60s, and though Muslims were part of that, it was rarely the case that anti-racist activism was conjoined with sort of religious vocabulary. And also, I think we just have a real difficulty just getting people to talk sensibly about religion in this country at all. So having an informed discussion is very difficult. And even people I see as allies in my own work on the kind of progressive wings of society will often just not even recognize Islamophobia, not because they're bad people, but just because they don't really know what to say or to do. I remember there was a case a few years ago of Michael Gove when he was Justice Minister, I think, and he was making claims about chaplaincy, prison chaplains being terrorists, and sort of claiming that they were anti-British because they were Deobandis and so on. Most people in Britain wouldn't recognise the term Deobandi. So if you don't know that, you can't tell that Michael Gove is talking a bit of nonsense. So there's kind of more work to be done. Hopefully we'll get there, inshallah.
For me, the most important finding is that people are reluctant to admit to anti-black sentiment.
Yeah.
Now, this is 50 years of work for the
anti-racism
exactly. movement. That is not simply not tolerated at any level. You might feel in your own that you don't like them, but you don't say it.
Yeah.
We will get to that point at least for Islamophobia.
No, I think so. I think so. Again, no, it's a complicated one because I do think it's important to be able to have conversations about religion and what's good or bad about that. And I don't think it's important to have conversations about what's good or bad about black people. They're qualitatively different things. I don't mind people making criticisms of religious communities and what they do and so on. That's perfectly fine. But it's just, you have to get to a certain point of literacy where you can have that conversation without it being prejudiced. And we're just not there yet, if I'm honest.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stephen. Really enjoyed the talk, and I think there's still a lot of questions. So those that still have questions can hopefully ask you after the talk if you're still around.
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Salawat.